Casinos are almost perfect examples of a highly designed system that is intentionally taking advantage of innumeracy.
Most people's vocabulary, when you're talking about probability, is limited to 1 in a million, 50-50, or sure thing. I bought a single lottery ticket, and after getting it, I tore it up. And people act like I kicked a puppy or something.
Our human OS is actually more driven by the emotional centers of the brain than the rational centers of the brain.
Most people don't really have a visceral feel for the difference between millions, billions, and trillions. The words rhyme, but they're vastly different.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with another episode of Infinite Loops. Today, I have on a man who actually changed my mind so much that I bought a dozen copies of his first book that I read, at least, called Innumeracy. John Allen Paulos has a PhD in mathematics from the University of Wisconsin. He is the author of Innumeracy, A Mathematician Plays the Stock Market, A Mathematician Reads the Newspaper, and he had a really profound effect on me, Professor Paulos. First off, welcome.
It's good to be here, and I'm flattered that the book had, you said, profound effect. I hope it was positive.
Very positive, very positive. I bought a dozen copies and gave it to friends who, specifically some friends who, when I would start talking about math or, well, you really need to understand statistics don't really work that way, they would just put their hands up and they'd say, I hate math.
Yeah, I know.
So I guess that's my first question. Why do so many people feel almost proud to say, oh, I hate math?
That's a good question. I think part of the reason is the way it's taught. It's generally taught as a bunch of formulas, and you're supposed to kind of blindly follow the algorithm and get an answer. And that's, part of it. But if analogy I sometimes use, imagine you're in English class in middle school, high school, and all you ever did was diagram sentences, you wouldn't have a real keen appreciation for English literature when you got to college. So these, finding the roots of a quadratic equation, 100 different equations, or the derivatives of polynomials, 100 different polynomials. I mean, that doesn't get to the actual, in a sense, analog of the literature of mathematics. It's, it's kind of playing chords on a piano. If you never play a song, you're not going to be real fond of your piano lessons.
That's a great way of putting it. And so I know that you've advocated for trying to teach math in a different way. If you wouldn't mind, give us some examples of ways that you think we could better get everyone from children all the way up to adults more excited about learning about math.
One way I think is to kind of embed it in one's, life's activity. In elementary school, play games, board games. Board games are a little passé now. Kids only play digital games. But when I was a kid, we played Monopoly, played Clue. But in any case, in elementary school, talk about anything kids are interested in. Something's on TikTok. How many people do you think saw it? What percentage is that? What are percentages? And recipes, same thing. How would we double that recipe? And when you get older, all comparable problems regarding money, if you're talking about stock market or even just personal finance, and there's some appreciation for common numbers with respect to which you can place the number that is placed before you. Most people, kind of a trite example, but I give it all the time, don't really have a visceral feel for the difference between millions, billions, and trillions. And millions, 11 and a half seconds approximately. A billion's about 32 years. and a trillion is about 32,000 years. So the numbers rhyme, the words rhyme, but they're vastly different. And unless you're aware of some feel, visceral feel for that difference, I mean, you're going to be any little hot button issue that, we're going to spend $56 million on that. That's horrible. I disagree with that. And, but we're going to do, increase expenditures by 2 trillion or cut taxes by 3 trillion. Whatever the merits of that, you should realize that's a vastly different number than millions or billions. And, some feeling for probability. What most people's vocabulary, when you're talking about probability, is limited to 1 in a million, 50-50, or sure thing. And there's not too much you can do with that very sparse vocabulary. And then talk about puzzles. I think puzzles are undervalued. They're mathematical puzzles, puzzles from science. Get away from the rote. I mean, you need the master the rote basics, but you want to induce people to think. Does that make sense? And with regard to math, I mean, that's very important. But if people have this very restricted view of what mathematics is, then of course they're going to put their hands up and say, "Oh, I hate math." On a plane, if somebody asks me what I do, I often, say something else or change the subject because it's tiresome to hear that they hate math.
Well, persistence through continual rejection is a path toward success many times, not always. I like all of those examples. And when I was trying to teach my kids math, after having read your books, one of the things that I tried to do was make it a fun story. Right. So, for example, compounding, exponential functions, all those, like, imagine the king needs something done for him, and the winning bidder says, "All I want is 1 grain of rice," and then that had doubled on a chessboard, right? And I still remember my son was a chess player, and we had some downtime, and I gave him that example. And it delighted me because his eyes got so wide when I said, "How many grains of sand do you think are going to be on that last square on the chessboard?"
Right.
And what I found was really cool was it animated him. It got him excited. Are there other stories that we could be working with our children, all the way up to adults, that would get it? I like your idea about game playing. Like, is there a process that you think would be vastly better if we're trying to get people to both appreciate, understand the importance of math, and how not having a firm grip on it can really be detrimental to many of your outcomes in life?
Right. Well, it's not something that one should do, educators should do, but something that, in addition, that they should do. And that is, as I say, related to things. I mean, the puzzles. Imagine there's a bag of potatoes, which weighs 100 pounds, and it's 99% water. And you leave it out overnight, and some of the water evaporates, and now the bag of potatoes is 98% water. It originally weighed 100 pounds. How much when it was 99% water, how much does it weigh when it's only 98% water? And it forces you to think through it, and the answer is counterintuitive. The answer is only 50 pounds. And but yet, problems like that, where the answer is either counterintuitive or just shocking. I mean, the number of ways of ordering a deck of cards, is 52 factorial. The first card in the deck could be any of the 52. That could be combined with any of the remaining 51 cards to be the second card, combined with any of the remaining 50. It's 52 factorial, which is approximately 10 to the 68th power. And that's, a number we can't grasp. I mean, it's probably the case that no one who shuffled a deck of cards ever got that particular order in the whole history of card playing and for the next 10,000 years of card playing. But again, a feel for the vastness of some numbers, the tininess of numbers, nano, everything is getting much more common. And so even just the basic idea of the size of numbers, if you don't have to talk about algebraic topology or different sorts of geometries. If people understood numbers and how to deal with them, as you said, exponential growth is a very important topic, and most people don't have any idea what's it. They use the word exponential kind of loosely, like, oh, it's growing exponentially. It just means it's getting bigger. It doesn't necessarily mean it's exponential. Sometimes if people really want to impress other people, they say, oh, this is growing logarithmically. But they don't know that means it's growing more and more slowly.
The law of large numbers is something that I have often tried to, through just fun quizzes, get people to understand. And yet the number of like really intelligent people in general, right? Like, for example, I would ask, okay, so the norm for births in a hospital is about 5 boys and 5 girls every night. If there were 2 hospitals, one was tiny and one was the biggest hospital in New York City, and
Right.
I told you that there were 9 boys and only 1 girl born, which hospital do you think it's more likely that they were born at? What do you think the vast majority of people I asked that question guess?
Yeah, well, I would guess that they would guess incorrectly. Yeah, no, I mean, that's why often, the best results for whatever you're trying to measure often occur in small towns, or as well as the worst results. And it's nothing that's particularly the case about their smallness, other than their smallness. And the central limit theorem isn't well understood. Just statistics in general, I mean, is not. I mean, it's a mistake to go too far and say everything is normally distributed, which is not. I mean, there's, as many people have pointed out, there are long tails, but for most everyday kind of quantities, the normal distribution is a good place to start.
Yeah, Mandelbrot turned me on to the chaotic distribution pattern in his The Misbehavior of Markets.
Right.
And that it's interesting because I got so used to kind of the normal distribution,
Right.
that starting to think about different distributions leads to different things. But back to the law of large numbers for a second, the thing that I would move on to then would be, this has profound implications in a variety of disciplines, government,
Wow.
medicine, etc. And how would you go about helping, say, a newspaper journalist better express the essence of a statement, where they can easily fall into these traps of the monkeying with statistics and or not understanding that the most unusual results come from the smaller sample size versus the large sample size? Is there a way that they could get better at that and communicate clearly the difference?
Maybe use examples, not necessarily from business or finance or medicine, but more everyday examples. I mean, let me think if I can. How about popcorn? It starts popping. There are a few pops, and then more and more, and then there's a crescendo. Stays there for a while, and then fewer and fewer, and then just the last few pops. And okay, maybe that's not the greatest example, but even the rate of popcorn popping follows a normal distribution. Or you look at a stairway, let's say a wooden stairway, and to your house, and or any building, and people go down the flight of stairs. Generally, they stick towards the middle, and so if you look at the way the stairs wear themselves are worn, it's kind of an upside down normal distribution. It's more worn in the middle and less so on either side, and very minimally so, unless or some people kind of maybe want to hug the wall. I don't know, but that would be a everyday example of a normal distribution, or just the common examples that are often given there. The circumference of babies' heads, or the length of leaves of a certain kind of tree, would follow a normal distribution. And I mean, it takes some getting used to, because people aren't used to thinking statistically. There wasn't any real reason for that particular cognitive attribute to be developed. I mean, and I'm speaking kind of very simplistically, but and long ago, if you heard you heard a rustle in the bushes, it paid to run like hell and not plug into base there, and to see it's very unlikely to be a tiger bird. But
I often use that to joke that we are all descendants of the people who ran away.
That's here for cowardice.
Exactly. And I find that cultural lag really fascinating, because I often say we live in a probabilistic world, and yet we remain deterministic thinkers. Tragedy or comedy often ensue, and like literally, there are things like, for example, the lottery, right?
No,
To me, I'm opposed to lotteries just because it looks to me like governments and others running them are literally taking advantage of innumeracy.
there.
And, I guess the cutest example that I often give is a quote from Fran Lebowitz, who says that she never bothers to buy a lottery ticket because she feels her chances of winning are the same or not. So,
Yeah.
but despite, are these things impervious to education?
I don't think so, but they do require it. I mean, they're talking about humorous takes on it. Voltaire is said to have remarked that the lottery is a tax on stupidity. But actually, your friend who didn't see a difference between your chances of winning reminds me of an incident. I was on a television show once, and it was focused on, this was a long time ago when Innumeracy was on the best television. So I went into a bodega with a television crew behind me, and I bought a single lottery ticket. And it was kind of a fanfare. We're investigating, how people react and how many tickets they buy. I bought a single one, and the focus was on me. The cameraman was there. And after getting it, I tore it up. And people act like I kicked a puppy or something. There's no discernible difference between my chances of winning, but it was worth the look on many of their faces just to do them.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that fascinates me. That's a visceral reaction based on, erroneous understanding of how lotteries work. And I just wonder sometimes how much of that is just so it's like pattern recognition in a way. Listen, humans are great pattern recognition machines, but when taken to an extreme, we impose patterns on random data, and that can often lead us very far astray. I just wonder, what techniques would you advocate? I like tearing up a lottery ticket, by the way. What techniques for these more, I'm most interested in trying to help people get to just basic understanding of concepts that are going to really add to their success in outcomes, right? Because for example, casinos. I used to give a lot of talks when I was still running an asset management company, which was quantitative and empirically driven. And I used to give a lot of talks in Las Vegas. And one of the first things that I did was mention to the entire audience that I always stay in the only hotel, which at the time was the Four Seasons. I don't know what it is now, that didn't have a casino. And like literally the gasps from the audience were audible. And then like after the talks, people would come up to me and almost always the number one question was, why gambling is fun? You'd think somebody like you who knows, the odds or the numbers would really love it. And then of course they bring up, the Kelly criteria and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
but
right.
It seems to me that casinos are almost perfect examples of a highly designed system that is intentionally taking advantage of innumeracy.
I think so. I mean, apophenia is a word I like. It's seeing, as you kind of referred to just recently, seeing patterns where they're not there. I mean, COVID is a good example. Oh, if you take the vaccine, you're going to get a heart attack or a blood clot. But you look at how frequently heart attacks, blood clots, and other things occur naturally, and there is not a higher rate with vaccines. But it's very hard to convince somebody who just got the vaccine and now has a blood clot, a serious blood clot, that some people get blood clots. Period. Well, I mean, randomness in general is difficult to recognize. There's, if you, let's say you've got two people flipping a coin, you call one Harry and the other Tom, for heads and tails, and you flip a coin, a single coin, and Harry bets on heads and Tom bets on tails. You do it 10,000 times. One of them at the beginning, after a few hundred, is going to be a head. There's going to be more heads than tails up to that point, or more tails than heads. But it's very likely that who's ever ahead near the beginning is going to be ahead at the end. And it doesn't mean that, Harry's, let's say Harry's a little bit ahead in the beginning, that he's sort of, clairvoyant. But it does mean that, the changing leads are kind of happen infrequently. And, it's not a big difference. It could be a fairly small difference. After 1,000, it could be 20 heads ahead of the tails. And, at the end, it might be, 15 or something. But, or even just runs. Runs are much more common than you think. You flip a coin 1,000 times, I'm never going to get 6 heads in a row or 7 tails in a row. But that's not true. It's fairly likely, and the number of runs, their length, this resistance to changing the lead, and a lot of other characteristics of randomness seem decidedly unrandom. So it's difficult to recognize randomness, and every time we make a mistake, I mean, a lot of mistakes in public policy and so on are because people have no idea what a random sample is. I mean, they talk to 23 of their friends, and most of them hate Biden or something. Yeah, but who are your friends? I mean, actually, my wife does that a lot. She always says, everybody says this. And who's everybody? Oh, yeah, those people. Anyway, so yeah, randomness is, I mean, there are lots of characterizations of it. I mean, the one way, if you want to characterize a sequence of zeros and ones, if it's random, there's no way to really describe that sequence. But if it's not, you can develop a formula of which, was shortened. Let's say there's 10,000 zeros and ones in your your sequence. But if you can shorten that, if there's a formula that has some influence, some significance, instead of just saying copy these 10,000 numbers in this order, maybe your program only needs 8,000 or 5,000 because there's some order in there that's not apparent. So if the sequence is not compressible, then it's random, but that's hard to show.
And back to the example you gave with COVID and comorbidities, is there a way, because you're absolutely right, people don't disambiguate the idea that lots of people get heart attacks all the time. Lots of people have blood clots. And I just wonder about the ability of someone trying to communicate that, as you do quite well in your numerous books. Like, it seems to me that there's got to be a better way to avoid all of that. Would there be some sort of, I don't know, like program that would say, well, you've got to really understand if these vaccines are having any horrible effects, you've got to normalize for the things over here. I just like, and if there is, why aren't news organizations doing it?
I'm not sure there is, but there's a lot of, even with regard to COVID, it might be the case if most people are vaccinated and people, anti-vaxxers will say, look, half the people in hospitals are ones who have been vaccinated. Yeah, but most people have been vaccinated, and let's say you're in an area where 90% of people, 95% of people are vaccinated, and the anti-vaxxers just say, go to the hospital. Half the people there have been vaccinated. Yeah, but they come from 95% of the population, not from 5%. And it's hard to get across. And you're right about lotteries, among other things. Almost designed to induce innumeracy. And now you talk about what's built in. We're, as has often been said, we're pattern-seeking animals. So apophenia is kind of a foible that we're all vulnerable to. We look for patterns, and often they're not there. We want them to be there, and they're not, so we'll make them up.
Yeah, I've often said that our human OS is actually more driven by the emotional centers of the brain than the rational centers of the brain, and that causes a lot of these problems. I wonder, what do you think about books and movies like Moneyball or The Big Short? Do you think that they did a service to people understanding math better, or did they do a disservice to people understanding that better?
I think overall, a kind of a service to show that, it's not what seems to be the case. It looks, or let's say GameStop or whatever. Anytime you have examples of these cognitive foibles holding sway, to expose those examples, I think that's useful. So you look at Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, the standard cognitive foibles, the anchoring effect and halo effect, and various other weird effects. The anchoring effect, I think, is very relevant to the market. People are anchored to whatever number they're given, whether it makes sense or not. And actually, I did in my classes, I did the following experiment, because I had one semester I took a colleague's course. It was, instead of teaching 2, I taught 3 because he owed me one because he had an operation or something. Anyway, I asked the 3 different courses to estimate the population of Turkey, a country about which most people don't know anything. But the first class, I'd say, is that more or less than 7 million people. most people, and I said, write it on a piece of paper, don't consult anything. First answer the question and then give me your estimate. So is it more or less than 7 million people? And most kids in the class said it's more than 7 million. Their estimates varied all over the place, more or less normally, actually, with the average being 15 or 20 million people. Different group of people, same thing. Is the population of Turkey more or less than 70 million people? Maybe it was 80 million. I said again, tell me whether it's more or less. Write it on a piece of paper, and then give me your estimate. Again, the number that I gave, 80 million, anchored them. They thought it was less, but maybe it's only around 60 million people. And then the third group of people, I did the same thing, but I had a little dial, a little randomizing device with the numbers 7 million, 80 million, 120 million, whatever. So in front of the class, I spun the dial, and wherever it landed, I say, tell me whether you think the population of Turkey is more or less than that number, and then give me your estimate. And oddly enough, the same effect happened. I mean, in the first two cases, it might be rational to think, well, this guy doesn't know anything about I don't know anything about Turkey, but this guy probably does. It's probably pretty close to the number he threw out there. But certainly the dial doesn't know anything about Turkey. And yet the same thing happened. If the dial landed on a big number, people guessed a big number for the population. If it landed on a small number, they guessed a small number. So, if they can attribute, intelligence to a random dial, they're clearly going to be anchored to whatever number you give them, and not just the population of Turkey, but in general. And that's kind of an amazing phenomenon.
Yeah, and I've seen that example used as, when was Genghis Khan born, for example?
Yeah.
Same idea as yours.
Yeah, well,
they would give a number, and people would anchor to it. Then they would give no number, and then they would randomize the number. Same
right.
effect. Same
Yeah.
effect.
Yeah,
And
it is though.
and that also kind of brings us into, like, when people are trying to make estimates. I often ask a question just I'm interested in how people are going to respond. And this is, I guess, what you'd call a confidence interval. Most people, when I ask, how many people do you think are in the United States that are worth $1 million or more? The number of people who give a specific number always amazes me.
Yeah.
The ones that I'm far more impressed by are the ones who give me quite a range. What they're demonstrating, as you know, is that, I don't know. Let me see if I can put it between two very broad paths. Now, I find that when I ask technologists this, for the most part, programmers, they give the range. But laymen not trained in computer science often give a very specific number. And that has often caused me just great consternation. A while back, there was a very popular thing on Wall Street called value at risk, and it's called VAR for short.
Okay.
And I campaigned against value at risk everywhere I was, because what it did was it maintained that it could give you a very specific number. You have a 13.7% chance of right.
I hate that. People are always giving very specific numbers. I mean, anytime you look at a commercial or anything, I mean, and it's absurd. You really think that? And yet a lot of people do it. And it is a good way to distinguish people with a technical background from those who don't. Because if you give something there, and you have this box, and you give its volume and its weight, and if you give its density by dividing one by the other to 7 decimal points, most people say, "Oh, this guy really knows his stuff." And if you give it to someone with a technical background, they say, "How could you get 7 decimal points for that? You give us the volume and the weight and broad, and not very precisely, and then you get this precise number out of it. But that happens all the time. Just watch television for half an hour, and I guess people think that it is more confidence-inducing. I really know your stuff. It's 8,420 people, 23 people signed up for that. That's not true.
I think that also is part of just the way we're constructed. People prefer certainty over uncertainty.
Right.
And, one of the things that I'm always banging on about is, listen, like most of the things you are going to confront in your life are highly uncertain just by their very, very nature. And yet, if you look at who wins the election, who wins the debate, who wins all of those things, and I've studied a lot of this, and almost always it's the person who has that false sense of precision, right? Like, you can't tell me because I know that 22.3% of the affected population is this, and then the other guy is kind of like, oh, wow, he really knows his numbers. Is there a way around that? Like, if we were debating and I pulled that trick and I said, well, Professor, you don't clearly understand Wall Street because I can tell you that 93% of all trades held for more than 5 years always lead to a positive outcome.
Yeah.
What would you smash me with?
One thing I sometimes have done is I imagine flipping a coin 1,000 times. The most likely outcome is you get 500 heads. How many of you want to bet that you're going to get 500 heads when you flip a coin 1,000 times? And then if they have money on the line, or even just virtually, they might recognize, okay, that's the number you'll likely get, but likely is not the same as most likely. It's not most likely. And that's one way. One quote I have in one of my books that gets cited a lot on Twitter and elsewhere is that the only certainty, uncertainty is the only certainty, and the only security is learning how to live with insecurity. And most people, you're right, they need certainty, or they think they need it, and it's scary if you just say, I don't know. It's not that I don't know. I mean, you do know things, but you're generally a confidence interval is, more confidently encompass the right number, whatever it is.
I always try to insert when I'm asking questions and hoping that I'm going to get a broader confidence interval answer. I will add, rather than asking for specific numbers, I'll say, which way do you think directionally this might go? And I found that when I do that, people sort of automatically move modes, right? They, rather than trying to assert some single number and or the frequency of occurrence or what have you, when you ask them directionally, what do you think about this?
Well, I'm not sure I understand. What do you mean by directionally?
By directionally, I'll say, we've just invested in this company, and here are the things that have happened since we invested that are good outcomes, like earnings where we thought that they should be, number of customers that we thought that they should be able to, and then I would introduce, and here are the things that kind of went badly. They didn't go the way that we were expecting them to go. You take all of this and combine it and kind of say to me, directionally, which way do you think that this company? What would be a reasonable expectation on our part as investors to directionally say this company should continue to do well, or this company should maybe will stumble more?
So it's a little bit like a confidence interval, but just a one-sided confidence interval.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's nice. I like that.
And I found that certain words can unlock the sort of deterministic thinking. I've got to give one number. I've got to give a yes, no, right response to this, because I am always amazed by the way you can, I guess, baffle them with bullshit, right? Like if you start throwing a bunch of numbers at people, I've actually seen it affect people, like really affect them. They even their body language changes. And that to me, again, just reinforces this idea that I would love to come up with a way educationally, and maybe it's just using all real world examples. That could be one that is helpful, but also on simple things like the classic question about when you add something, the chances of it declining, right? So Mary is a librarian and is very active in the women's movement, and then you say there are so many librarians and there are so many women who are very active in the women's movement. Anyway, I'm doing this wrong because I'm doing it from memory, but the idea that so many people will answer when given that information at the start, will say, no, I'm certain that Mary is a librarian, yes, but she's also active in the women's movement,
right? Yeah,
which of course doesn't work mathematically, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, because the probability of two conditions being met is smaller than the probability of one of them. Yeah, I mean, I think one way Mary is a cashier at a local supermarket, and two, Mary got a PhD in physics, which would be real extreme. What's more likely? She's a cashier at the supermarket, or she's a cashier at the supermarket and is active in the women's movement. Forget the physics. And anyway, you can make it so that, there's always a trade-off between probability and plausibility. Often to make things more plausible, you add details often, and the details make the outcome less probable, but more plausible. And people like stories, and if you fill it out a little bit, a lot of different conditions, the probability of all those conditions holding is going to be smaller than the probability of some prosaic condition that you start out with. And I think most people don't realize this trade-off between plausibility and probability.
One of the things that I put in one of my books on this subject was the idea, and I can't remember whose study this was, but it really did grab my attention. And that was this: if you randomly select kids in an undergraduate class on math, and you say to the group, I'm going to tell you a fact. The fact is, there's a town of 100,000 people, and within that town, there are 70,000 lawyers and there are 30,000 engineers. Okay. Then the first group, you randomly select names out of a bag, and it's just a name. Jim, Paul, Mark, Mary. When they have just the name, they use and their objective is to get the most right? Most will say, well, to get the most right, I'm going to guess that they're all lawyers because there's 70% lawyers, 30% engineers. I'm going to say they're all lawyers. I'll get 7 out of 10 right. And the subjects actually do behave that way.
Okay.
But then when you add meaningless descriptive information to the name, Tom is 38 years old and likes to garden, people begin to abandon the probabilities that they know, right? 70% lawyers, 30% engineers.
Yeah.
And their correct answers goes down.
Yeah.
And then the clincher is they add stereotypical information.
Yeah, right.
Frank is 42 years old, likes mathematical puzzles, and is an introvert. People will literally argue with the professor saying, I don't
It's got to
care if
be an
it's
engineer.
99, it's got to be an engineer,
Yeah.
right? And so that got me very interested in, is there a way that we can use these default assumptions on the part of people to better get them to understand taking the next step and thinking, oh, that really doesn't matter. That those superfluous details don't really matter if I know the base rate, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one way is just to expose students to these kinds of things over and over again. I mean, if how many times is this going to happen? You ask somebody and it gives you a point estimate. Just ask somebody else in class, and then somebody else, and then somebody else. And presumably they'll differ. And you say, why would they differ? Man, maybe, why did it not be better to say it's not 72, but 70 to 80 or 65 to 85? And yeah, I mean, it is amazing. Well, one marginally relevant thing comes to mind. If is a question I ask in an elementary probability course. There's two people, and you're flipping. I'm fond of, as many probabilists are fond of coins, but there's two people. You flip a coin 100 times, and before each flip, you ask the person to tell you what they think it's going to be. And the first person gets 52 correct guesses out of 100. We anticipated the coin. He said heads. 52 times it was heads. And the other one predicts 28 times. He was correct 28 times. And I said, which one of these people has any claim to being a clairvoyant? And which result is most in need of an explanation? And anyway, students often get that wrong. I mean, 28 correct answers is amazingly improbable, but it doesn't register that they're so improbable. One person got 52 correct guesses, the other 28, and it takes a while. I mean, after enough badgering and other examples for them to say, oh yeah, it's very unlikely. I mean, you can talk about standard deviation, get how likely it is and so on. But even just intuitively, 28, I mean, he must be either clairvoyant, which is probably absurd, or just ignorant of statistics, standard deviation.
That was another one of my little hobby horses while I was running my company, O'Shaughnessy Asset Management, was the idea that the standard deviation of return, that became a term of art for asset managers, right? And so people would say, what's the standard deviation of return? What's the standard deviation of return? And I would tell them. And then I would say, but are you interested in that? Or are you asking that because you're worried about losing money? And they would say, well, I'm worried about losing money. And then I was like, wouldn't you want the highest standard deviation of return for something that was going like a rocket ship up? What you're really worried about is the semi-standard deviation below zero. In other words, when things are losing money. And I thought that was relatively straightforward. And like the looks that I got were like, for our listeners who aren't watching the video, I'm looking quite confused. So the other thing that I know you've written about, and I've always been fascinated with, is the prisoner's dilemma.
Right.
Books and books and books have been written about it. What do you? I'm sure you're familiar with Douglas Hofstadter's tit for tat solution to the prisoner's dilemma. Right. Why do you think so many people misplay the prisoner's dilemma? Number one, and is it something that like tit for tat, by the way, for our listeners and viewers, is basically they used to have competitions back in the 70s where people would write code to try to
Right.
beat a continuous prisoner's dilemma game, right?
Right.
And the number of codes that were submitted that were pages and pages and pages was quite high. And the one that won was called tit for tat. In other words, begin by cooperating, and then when the other prisoner rats you out, retaliate, but go back to cooperation. And that continued to win. And people just, it seems to me when I talk about that with people, they seem to really dislike a simple solution. Is that part of the math anxiety?
I don't know. I mean, it's more a function of, more relevant to one's psychology. I mean, maybe people enjoy retribution or insist on it. I mean, well, he screwed me. I'm going to get him good. And so, I mean, again, it's maybe a failure to think abstractly about a situation and instead, view it from a very personal viewpoint. I mean, I think that a feeling for abstraction is important. It doesn't mean you can, do all kinds of things in partial differential equations, but just kind of abstract the situation and see if it can be clarified. I mean, even something as well, that's not a good example, but
the researcher Flynn, who got the title "The Flynn Effect" on rising IQs,
right,
observed that he felt in what he wrote and in speeches I heard him give, he felt that it was our ability as human beings to become better at abstraction, which was the reason why IQs generally went up over that period of time that he was looking at. And he made his case by looking at answers to quizzes given, I think, in the year 1900. And all of those answers were very concrete, no abstraction at all. And then with the rise of technology, et cetera, children, adults became more comfortable, at least somewhat more comfortable, with the idea
I think
of...
that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, it doesn't mean that people easily go to the abstract level to better appreciate the logical skeleton of whatever they're dealing with. But it does mean that people have improved. I mean, they play games online. There's much more of an emphasis on abstract rules. I mean, people don't call them that, but then was the case. And I think if that's going to be a measure of IQ, I mean, that's going to explain the Flynn effect, which hasn't gone far enough, however.
Indeed.
Actually, even what I was going to mention, maybe it's worth mentioning, even simple puzzles, I mean, can benefit if you just look at kind of subtract the human context. I mean, like the Monty Hall problem, that behind one door, there's a car, behind the other two, there's nothing. And you pick a door, and then the host asks you if you want to switch or not, and you should switch. And you can make that more plausible if there's 10 doors, behind one of which is a car, and you pick, you pick a door, the host says you can switch, but first he opens 8 other doors, and then it's very clear that you should switch. But the abstraction comes in, hey, what if you wanted to avoid the car? Instead of a car, there was a toxic blast of gas that came out if you picked that door. And then if you pick a door and the host asks you if you want to switch, you should not switch. You don't want to increase your chances of getting that toxic blast. So, I mean, again, it's perhaps a trivial example, but everyday puzzles and games often contain the kernel of more human situations, or contain the logical skeleton of more human situations.
So if we gave you kind of carte blanche to design introduction to mathematics for everyone, let's not just limit it to children. What does that course look like?
It's hard to say. I mean, and I don't want to venture into a very contentious realm called the math wars. But we'll have some emphasis on computation. That shouldn't be left out. But anything that enthrone people's thinking about problems, again, want them to a higher level. If puzzles were an example, that would be good. If you're talking about analytic geometry, immediately explore shapes that correspond to certain equations. And you can do that in a way without being too rigid. I mean, y equals x squared, then what does y equals x squared plus 3 look like? That's very simple. You just look the parabola up 3 units. So, I mean, and also stories. I realize I'm being very nebulous here, but stories, vignettes are, if possible, and often they are, a better way to impart mathematical ideas than just the equations and formulas. I mean, it's one thing I've done in most of not all my books, but some of them have dealt with other things. But to the extent you can tell a story and give a little vignette, to give a little aphorism, sometimes even that'll do. You can get a mathematical idea across without kind of raising people's unnatural fear of mathematics. I mean, this isn't mathematics. This is a story about somebody who collects these things, and then for every 2 he gets, he gives away 3, and so on. So vignettes, stories, whatever. Again, it's a tall subject, and again, it's very contentious. I mean, in California, they're doing something like that, but they are running into trouble because sometimes they've gone too far. And at the other extreme, there are people who just want to focus on algorithms and computation, and without regard to anything other than the algorithm, and many different examples of it.
I think one of the things that I've encountered is just the term algorithm, right? People seem to me to get worked up about that in an unusual way, because I asked one person, a friend who is one of those people, and I said, what is it about that term that gets you so excited against it? And he goes, I don't want, my actions, which are up to me. I don't want some abstract algorithmic thing up here determining what I'm going to do next. And I'm kind of looked at him and I went, I don't think it's determining what you are going to do next. I think what it's trying to do is predict what you're going to do next. And yet, they remain flustered. And again, I like your version of telling stories. I finally gave in because basically the way that we invested was highly algorithmic, was highly based on quantitative methodologies. And yet when I was giving talks, I would often finally begin the talk with, I'm going to tell you a series of stories about why you shouldn't pay attention to stories when selecting investments. and this, it worked. It worked. I got people to understand things like base rates, things like, various distributions historically. What do they imply for the future? All of that. But I only really seem to be able to break through to a general audience. Now, I'm not talking to other asset managers, but a general audience.
Yeah.
And I it worked so well, I never stopped. I just kept saying, okay, let me tell you a story about that. The study I mentioned earlier was one of those stories about the people with the lawyers and engineers in the town. Right. People seem to really get that and understand, oh, that's why base rates are important. That's why knowing those numbers are important. And I would actually have people come up to me and say, well, I thought you were going to just be throwing a bunch of math at me, and like I'm just so delighted that you didn't do that, which brings us kind of back to math anxiety, and the challenge that we face is, there are some life and death decisions being made where innumeracy can lead the person, unfortunately, to make the wrong choice and end up dying.
Yeah, look at COVID. COVID is an example. So is global warming that people poo-poo because they don't look at the numbers at all. Yeah, I mean, every big issue. I mean, I think the cognitive foibles is a good way to, should be introduced in math class. I mean, there's lots. I mean, look at Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. There's lots of examples whose conclusions are very counterintuitive but yet very common. And I think it goes some way towards getting people not to believe everything they think.
But you've also, another big tool in the toolkit of behavioral economists is this idea of nudging. And you, from what I've read that you've written, you have some problems with nudging. Do you mind sharing those with us?
Well, it can go too far. It can be very patronizing, very limiting. But the general idea to make in some sense, the right decision, assuming you know it, easier to decide upon, I have no problem with. But often people do that for decisions in furtherance of a decision, which is not the right decision, at least uniformly the right decision. And it can be, kind of big brother-ish, but overall it's okay.
Yeah, the big brother aspect has always been one that made me a little reticent because, for example, a classic nudge that seems to work and leads to what I think is generally, in most circumstances, a better outcome is on when a new employee joins a firm, the simple changing of having them opt into the 401k versus a nudge, which changes it to they must opt out of the 401k.
Yeah.
Well, you can see what happens there.
Yeah.
The vast majority end up in the 401k because they don't want to opt out. But when they're opting in, it's quite a bit lower. So those kinds of nudges, I think, obviously can be quite helpful. But then the big brotherish type, it does become just a question of, I guess, extremes, how much you want to do that.
People always further this idea of nudging with a non-controversial example. And that, I'm sure you and your listeners, at the bottom of a urinal, you put a little a spider or something that looks like a spider or a butterfly, and people want to pee on it. So there's let's pee on the floor. But that's uncontroversial. But lots of are not. Some other things are not.
Yeah, and that's the challenge. Another thing that I've found is that if you look and study at some of the greatest financial fiascos in history, some pretty simple math was at the center of causing them. And I just sometimes I've had conversations with people on leverage, for example, and how deadly leverage can be. And once you use a certain level of leverage, you're pretty much guaranteed to end up going broke if you're using it incorrectly. Yeah. And even like professional investment people that I will give these examples to, like, dismiss me out of hand. And, I had talks with some folks who were involved in a very big financial fiasco back in the 90s. And even afterwards, they couldn't grasp that using 40-to-1 leverage on a relatively illiquid asset generally leads to ruin. And so I was lucky enough to meet Danny Kahneman several times and have these conversations with him. And he
Unfortunately,
came
he
in.
just died.
I know.
Yeah,
A great loss. He was a lovely, wonderful man.
yeah, and he was.
And so I wonder if there would be some sort of, like the whole value at risk thing we talked about earlier. Do you see any way where what the category that I generally put this in is people who should know better, right? Making that like an investment advisor or a portfolio manager, et cetera. Do you think that there would be, if you were going to give them one or two classes that they should attend to really get a better handle on things like we've been discussing, which classes would you point them at?
I guess some sort of math class that used Innumeracy and a mathematician plays the stock market, or a mathematician reads a newspaper, but there's some kind of statistics class that wasn't the kind of, here's a bunch of formulas and do this and you use a t-test and you get this and find the p-value, which doesn't really help much, I don't think. I mean, it's too much like, oh, that's math, I hate it. Well, I mean, which is not to say you should forego discussing those things, but better put them into a context, into a story where it makes sense. And that's hard to do. I mean, there's a book on statistics by somebody named Freedman, Pisani, and somebody else who does a good job with the technical aspects of probability. I would use that book. And there are. It's hard to say. I mean, even simple things like, the black skulls. Not that that's simple, but I mean, part of what went wrong is they assumed a bunch of events were independent when they're not. I mean, forget black skulls. I mean, what's the probability that 3,000 people or whatever are going to die in New York tomorrow? That's absurd. That's minuscule, unless they're all in the same building on 9/11.
Right.
And so, I mean, without, you got to worry about independence, and often it's not clear when events are independent or not. I mean, people want to assume they are because it makes things easier, and you generally just multiply. But that's not a mathematical decision. That's above this. Metamathematics in a different sense of metamathematics, where you've got to know the context that makes sense of it. And that's not taught a lot. Instead, the formal procedures are emphasized, or not just emphasized, but almost to the exclusion of anything else.
Not strictly mathematically relevant, but I always thought that people like Professor Feynman, who had a certain degree of, he was very theatrical. And if you remember when the Challenger crashed,
the O-ring.
Exactly. But the brilliance of him asking quite specifically, could you bring me a glass filled with ice? And then he takes the material from the O-ring, drops it in the glass of ice, and it ultimately disintegrates. I wonder if that could also be a useful way to get mathematical concepts across, like in a form of entertainment, really.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, math class doesn't have to be dull and boring, and even tricks, even irreverent tricks on people, I think would arouse many people's interest, especially young people. I mean, so-called magic tricks and scam people out of a bunch of money. Why does it work?
Exactly. Well, you have certainly done that in your many books. Do you have anything on the horizon? I know you just had one published a couple of years ago.
Yeah, who's counting? It has a lot of puzzles in it, but I not yet. I mean, what I generally do is I put a bunch of ideas into a file and let them stay there and until they begin to marinate, if they ever do, and marinate into something coherent. So I'm in the waiting for marination stage.
Well, listen, this has been absolutely phenomenal. I'm a huge fan. I think one of my associates who's here saw this book because I pulled it off the shelf, and he's like, "Ooh, can I borrow that book?" So maybe just literally leaving your books around where people can actually see them, as opposed to in the bookshelf, might be the right thing. At the end of this podcast, we play a little game, which is...
Before we do that, let me say, I really enjoyed talking to you, Jim. It was a very good interview.
Oh, well, thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you as well. I'm passionate about trying to help people understand these concepts better, as are you. And you're much better at it than I am. But at the end here, what we do is we do a little bit of magical thinking, and we say that we're going to wave a wand and we're going to make you emperor of the world for one day. You can't kill anyone. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. But what you can do is, since this is all magic anyway, we're going to give you a magical microphone, and you can say two things into that microphone. And all of the world's population, whenever their tomorrow is going to wake up and they're going to think, I've just had two of the best ideas I've ever had. And unlike all those other times, I'm going to write them down. And after writing them down, I'm going to actually start acting against them. What two things are you going to incept in the world's population?
Well, I think anything that induces a certain wariness, measured wariness. You don't want people, and you don't want people to believe everything they think. You want people to entertain the possibility that they're wrong. And they should ask themselves that daily. I say this, and I'm pretty sure it's right, and it probably is, but let me just think about it a little more and not be a little bit tentative, but not empty-headed, not entertain everything, but I don't know. So skepticism, wariness, an appreciation of their inherent uncertainty of life are good traits to develop. And unfortunately, they're, I think, in short supply.
Yeah, I agree. The author, Robert Anton Wilson, had a lovely quip that was, anytime you stop and think to yourself, maybe I'm just a cosmic schmuck, he says, you make yourself, for a little bit of time, a little less of a cosmic schmuck.
All right. That's a nice two words to end this interview on.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. Really enjoyed it. And let's see if we can chip away at innumeracy. I think we can.